Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Cricket Central podcast. This is our day 2 recap of the first test between Australia and the West Indies from Perth. It was a day where 379 runs were scored with a loss of just 2 wickets. The bat once again dominating the ball. My name is Vas Shipp, filling in the host chair for Ted Jarvis, and joining me is the great man Ethan Prabhaharan. Prabs, how are we?
Well, thanks. Good to get you back in the hosting chair. It's exciting times for the podcast.
Yes, good to be back to where it all started. Rightio, it was a day that started with the Australians on 2 for 293. Smith and Marnus Labuschagne would add further 109 runs. Marnus Labuschagne bringing up his second double century, falling soon after on the stroke of lunch. He was bowled. Then Smith and Travis Head come on, put in a partnership of 196. The West Indies again toiling out there in the heat before Travis Head falling cruelly for 99, one short of a century. It was a runnable 99 off 95, bowled by Craig Braithwaite. He actually had both the wickets today, which shows, I guess, you a little bit how the West Indies bowling lineup suffered. With that was enough for Patrick Cummins to declare the innings on 4 for 598 off some 152.4 overs, with Steve Smith not out on 200 again, bringing up a double century of his own. And the West Indies none for 74 at the close off 25 overs. An early LBW shout reviewed off Chanderpaul. The only real major chance. But yes, the West Indies closing the day, none for 74. That's still trailing the Australians by 524 runs with 10 wickets remaining and 3 days plays remaining. Perhaps, I guess, the main takeaway, just dominance for Australia, and it was their 2 stars getting it done again with the bat.
Yeah, it's great to see both Labuschagne and Smith in form and really showing their class at the international level. I think it's been about 10 years since we had 2 players make double hundreds in an innings. And I think the thing about Marnus is he made these runs on the back of a very lean patch in the Shield. There are some players who, despite poor domestic form, you back to just ascend to a new level on the international scene. And somehow Marnus is one of those players. And it was a lovely knock, and he's really cemented his mark and turned 100 into a really mammoth score. I think it was raised on comms that his last 3 tons he's fallen below 110. So it was great for him to carry on and pass the 200 score, and no doubt him and Smithy will really love that. For Steve Smith, it was just a case of proving his words. I think he announced before this innings that he felt invincible, that he was back, would get the Steve Smith of old. And if this innings is any indication of what to expect for the rest of the summer, then I think the West Indies and South Africans will be quivering in their boots, because it was a lovely, solid knock of 200 not out. He looked solid and fluid from the get-go. And it seems almost comical, the fact that he's made technical changes to look almost more conventional and more normal, and it seems that it's all paying off. And you do have to scratch your head and wonder if he'd been batting like this all along. Would we see something Bradman-esque, or would we have seen something a bit more normal? And that's an interesting question to put forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't have asked for a better start to the summer for either, starting with Marnus Labuschagne, the second double hundred. Had 215 against New Zealand a couple of summers ago at the Sydney Cricket Ground. And then, as you mentioned, had scores in the low 100s against India, England, and Sri Lanka. That's a massive score. You'll feel really good about that. And then, as you mentioned, Stephen Smith, what more could be said, reaching his 29th Test century in his 4th double. Had previous doubles all against England, interestingly. So his first double ton not against England, 2015, 17, and 19. He brought them up. His 29th century puts him 4th all-time level with the great Donald Bradman, still behind Ricky Ponting, Matthew Hayden, and Steve Waugh there. You mentioned it's been a decade, 2012, last time we had 2 batsmen score a double century in the same innings. Ricky Ponting and Michael Clarke, it was at the Adelaide Oval against India. And I think it's fitting that those were the 2 batters, arguably of that generation in the Australian side. These will be the 2 batters of this. And this current generation. Steve Smith, still 33, so a lot of cricket left in him. This does beg the question: could you call it a lean patch for Smith? I guess it's his third now Test century in the last 3.5 years. Had 26 in the 5 playing years before that. That's, of course, excluding the 1 year he spent out with the suspension. But 26 in 5 years was a ridiculous amount. There was this talk about him being mortal with only 3, in the last 3.5 years, as you've mentioned. That technique, readjusted, left out of the shorter overformed, formats and all that. He's come back. He's made a massive score. I guess I've got a two-parter for you. Number one, where does he sit currently? I guess among the upper echelon of Australian batters of all times, and where does he sit in world cricket at the moment, alongside the likes of Root, Kohli's always up there, Williamson and Labuschagne?
Yeah, good questions for sure. I think the phrase that got thrown around when he hit those 26 tons in that 5 year patch was the best since Bradman, and I think he makes a strong case for that. His average is back up over 61 now. He's got a good conversion rate. And I think really what happened in that lean patch was teams started to almost figure out his technique, and he was almost limited by it. We saw abnormal fields. It's a shame England couldn't work out something despite their pleas on the various stations and bus stops about how to get Steve Smith out. But I mean, there was a couple of bumpers. Neil Wagner had an interesting bouncer ploy, and teams stopped pretty much bowling normally to Steve Smith's abnormal technique. And it did seem for a while that he was, a bit slow to adapt to it all. And there was that lean patch, as you mentioned, without a ton for a while. And in the midst of that, there was a batsman who was trying to transition to a couple of other formats as well. I think there was a couple of innings against India in the one days that strike to me as pretty significant. The fact I think he managed 100 off 65 and 66 balls. So the focus perhaps was on those other formats too, and trying to figure out a mindset that was adjustable to all three. But I think now with this technical change, he's got the power back in his own hands, and he seems to be batting with fluency and channeling the Steve Smith of old. I do have him over the likes of Ponting, but I think it's hard to match that longevity, and it's yet to be seen. I guess if teams will figure him out once more, and we'll see another perhaps drop. But certainly his numbers currently are up there with the best, and it's only natural to compare him to someone like a Bradman. I think across the last few years, we've also seen drop offs in players like Kohli and Williamson to a lesser extent, but so Joe Root's really been the dominant force in batting. But I think Steve Smith at his best has always been the best in the world. I mean, Joe Root was a class act, but I think now that Smith has come out with this 200, I think he's made a strong statement saying he's back at being the best of the world. He's probably going to have to back it up with a couple more scores to ascend Joe Root, given Root's previous record. But I think peak Steve Smith trumps peak Joe Root, and if this lean patch does subside, I think the English will be fearful coming for the Ashes.
Yeah, Joe Root hasn't exactly covered himself in glory, in recent times with his low score in England's test against Pakistan. I think Pearson would complain that I've managed to find a negative in that batting performance from the English, but we'll get on to Bazball a little bit later. I mean, they're averaging 60 and 57, respectively, in Test match cricket. As long as Australia has those two, at 3 and 4 there in the order, they're going to be in safe hands. Would feel extra sweet. Smith hadn't had a big score at Perth Stadium. Now he's got obviously a 200. That was his first score of even 50 at Perth Stadium, and also against the West Indies, he had a cruel 199 back in 2015 on the tour to the West Indies. So now he's got that 200 under his bed. Travis Head, 99, I mentioned it earlier. Craig Brathwaite got both the wickets today, which again shows you something about the, desperation or the lack of success of the rest of the bowling lineup. The dismissal, Prabs, I mean, I'm sure one that Travis is going to replay over and over in his head for the next, weeks or months. just trying to glide a rather straight ball on the stumps through, I guess, kind of through the offside point, backward point. Probably not the sort of shot you'd be looking to play. That ball just plays straight. You're on 99 and, live to fight the next ball.
Yeah, it was a shot of someone on 99, wasn't it? If there was ever a batsman trying to manufacture a single, probably from
Mm-hmm.
one that wasn't there, it was that shot. I think often there's an issue of trying to cut it when it's a bit too straight. It's a very common dismissal against the off spinner of players almost trying to cut it when it's back on the stumps. You're not going to get a lot of turn from Brathwaite either. And I think, yeah, he was just trying to be a bit too cute with it. Probably it's a solid block or even leave there, but he's trying to work for a one to get the quick single. In all fairness, that's how he's played the whole innings with aggression and intent rather than being laid back with that high strike rate as you've mentioned. But yeah, it is a shame because it's often quite difficult to come out after a large partnership and really make some runs. But he brought intensity from the get go. Would have been good to carry on from his ashes with another ton, but certainly good signs for him and good signs for the flexibility of Australia's team as well. We've got that backbone of the top four, and we'll assume some intent coming from batsmen 5 to 7.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the Aussies' batting performance, and deservedly so. Moving on to the Windies and their bowling performance. I know yesterday you questioned the tactics, perhaps not aggressive enough, sort of willing to kind of sit back and maybe let the Australian batsmen get themselves out. Well, they were far too good for any of that, apart from obviously that Trevor's head dismissal. A lot of defensive fields, players on the boundary. Boring cricket, a lot might call it, just giving 4 or 5 singles and over, and that was pretty much what happened for most of the day. Just ticking it along nicely. The odd boundary for Labuschagne, Smith, and Head. If they had their time again, well, may seem like a bit of an obvious question, but would they rethink those tactics?
I think even before tactics, they've probably got to think about selection a little bit. I mean, we've criticised England's attack for having a lot of right arm medium pace, but really Roach, Steele, Holder, Mayers all bowl quite similar. And that aside, the main issue for me is Frost and Chase playing as the spinner at 8. I think that's a wasted position. He's come up with 31 overs, none for 140, going at 4.5 runs per over. And that's the opposite of what you want from your off spinner. You need at least a little bit of control, if not someone to hold up an end and allow a bit of attack from the other end. So I think they almost shot themselves in the foot with their selection. And they did start bright. It was a good sort of first 10, 20 overs with Seals taking out Warner early on in the innings. But yeah, you did feel a gear sort of shift almost to this a bit more defensive bowling. They didn't look really like taking a wicket for a large periods of the game. And you're right. I think at a certain stage, it just became too easy to hit singles, and the runs will flow in Australia. But there just wasn't any control or any venom. I think we've portrayed Aldari Joseph as the enforcer, but he's probably not quick enough for that role. He doesn't have a great record in Test cricket, so I think the West Indies got serious questions to ask. They're almost limited by the quality of their side on this pitch, but again, their tactics aren't doing themselves any favour. And it did look a very resigned effort this morning as well, almost waiting for Australia to hit the runs and then giving them a chance to bat.
Yeah, and I mean, tough opening innings, not just obviously in terms of the runs conceded, but the amount of time they were in the field, the amount of overs they had to bowl. Roach 26 overs, Seals 21, Joseph 24, Mayers 15, Jason Holder, who's on the wrong side of 30, 23, Chase obviously the 31, and Brathwaite was into his 13th over when he picked up that second wicket of Head. Hot weather over in Perth. Interesting to see how the conditioning plays out. Obviously, you'd think they'll have a break, possibly break for the rest of the Test match, depending on what happens with the on the batting scorecard for the West Indies. Talking of that, we will move over to 25 or so overs that the West Indies did face. I mentioned, I believe it was the third or fourth over, the third that Stark bowled, but there was an LBW shout on Chanderpaul. Richard Dillingworth gives it not out. Umpire's call going over the stumps, just very slightly clipping the top of the off bail. I guess beyond that, What did you make of this performance? The Aussies batting and the Aussies bowling, excuse me, and the performances of Brathwaite and Chanderpaul.
Thought it was a solid start from the West Indies. What you don't want after hitting conceding 600 is to capitulate with the bat and get bowled out for 200. I think the openers are probably the backbone of their side, even though the middle order has shown some promise and on occasion has all been shown to stand up and play some quite brilliant knocks. But I think we can expect low strike rate play from Craig Brathwaite. I mean, to me, he looks like someone who probably his intent is just to bat balls and try and hit, 30 every 100 or so balls. His 18 not out of 79 does show that, even though that itself is probably even slow for him. And Tagenarine Chanderpaul showed a bit of flair and a bit of intent. I thought he was willing to play shots, particularly against the short bowling. And it did bring up, I guess, a tactical question for the Aussies. I think Ponting mentioned they started full, challenging the bat, and getting some play and misses, but a short ball ploy was quickly sought. And to be fair, even though Tagenarine went for it, I think it was generally pretty well controlled. So I think Australia have got some questions to ask as well. Cam Green not brought into the attack just yet, so we'll see how workload management looks for him. But I mean, it was a solid start from the West Indians, and they've really set forward the question to Australia: you've got to get us out, and it's going to be 20 hard wickets to get. And I think that's a good message to set. It was a shame that we didn't get that sort of message in their fielding innings, but I think if they do show this sort of defiance, particularly Brathwaite, Nathan Lyon might have the role holding up an end with attack from the other ends, and the quality spinner might even be the difference between the sides on this bouncy Perth pitch.
And Chanderpaul receiving somewhat of an uncomfortable welcome to the Test match arena, getting hit in the unmentionables by Josh Hazlewood left him seemingly uncomfortable, as you might imagine, for a sustained period of time. But he's still out there, and as you said, going at a rather proactive 47 off 73, as opposed to Brathwaite's 18 off 79. But 0 wickets is the key there, you'd agree, going into day 3. Talking of day 3, you mentioned line holding down an end, and for me it is quite frustrating as a spectator. It's so often the criticism is they dropped too short, they were too short of a length. As you said, often start they put the ball up, it's nibbling around with the seam that they're getting plays and misses, they're getting edges, and then it's always that temptation to creep short and to I guess it's just something that fast bowlers enjoy doing, trying to intimidate and all that, and setting fields. As you mentioned, we saw it with Stephen Smith, with a lot of oppositions going back years and having the leg slip in or having the person deep backward square leg. Do you think we're going to see the Australians persist with that? What would you like to see them do in day 3?
Well, I think these batsmen have looked pretty solid early on. I think early in the day is the best chance to get the wicket, and I'd like to see it full and pitched up. I think you'll get these batsmen nicking off and nicking behind. They have shown a tendency to hang the bat probably around the 5th stump line. So I'm happy with the short ball as a variation or as a setup. I don't think that should be the main strategy until later on, or it shouldn't even be considered till later on. But yeah, I think nicked behind is the main chance. There might be some sort of pace in the pitch or a little bit more movement, but it's hard to say. There hasn't really been a lot so far. But yeah, I think just frustrating these batsmen, even though Brathwaite will look to bat long, almost hanging him at an end, building some pressure and nibbling away at that good length. Really, that's what Hazlewood and Cummins' bread and butter is. So I'd rather them go down that avenue and then use a short ball as a secondary measure.
And a penny for your thoughts. A quick prediction: where do we end up as stumps on day 3?
Oh, it's interesting going back to these. I'd like to see the West Indies offer some resistance and maybe end up at about 7 for 300. Although
Is batting
we'll
out
see
the
if they
day a
can.
pass?
I think they'd take 7 for 300, to be honest. I don't think they're looking at 6. Well, they might be optimistic, but I don't think the rational thinker would predict 600 in response. So I reckon if they can bat out the day and hit, yeah, get to 300, I reckon that's a win for the West Indies.
Yeah, indeed, I agree. Before we go, we have to talk about the English. Pearson Lynch isn't here to just to wax lyrical about this performance. So it's just going to be analytical facts at the moment. The first test between Pakistan and England at Rawalpindi, excuse me, and at the conclusion of the first day's play, somewhat ridiculously, England 4 wickets down for 506 runs. When I first heard, I was listening to the Australian match on the radio in the car. When I first heard them talking about the speed with which the English were batting, I just presumed it was a one-day international match. That is the sort of flair we were seeing from the English batsmen. It's a staggering scorecard. Perhaps looking at it, Crawley, pretty much a runnable 122, Duckett a runnable 107, Pope a runnable 108. Have to look at the last time the top three batsmen all scored hundreds in Test match cricket. Joe Root, very disappointing. LBW just for 23. Harry Brock is not out 101 off 81, and Ben Stokes not out 34 off 15, striking at more than 2 runs a ball. Bazball alive and well, perhaps.
There is a little bit of baseball in it, but it's almost a bit of ugly cricket as well. I think there's been plenty of criticism of the pitches in Pakistan. They've been pretty conducive to batting, pretty flat decks, and really England are just hopefully sending a message to the Pakistani groundsmen to make some proper pitches. I think it's just a laughable scorecard, really. Plenty of comments can be made about Joe Root here because he's currently the only person who's been dismissed below 107. But it is quite phenomenal to think that Australia have dominated the West Indies and hit just under 600 in 152 overs. In less than half of the overs, England are now on 500. And they've gone at over 6 runs and over, and they've only managed 75 overs in a whole day's worth of cricket, presumably because the ball's been smacked around the ground and just dispatched to the rope. I think it's probably still going to be grim tomorrow. I'd keep an eye out on Stokes and Livingston because if there was ever a time that the record for the fastest Test 100 would be broken, it might be these two on this pitch. So it could get very, very ugly for Pakistan tomorrow, particularly because England are batting at such a rate. We might see a monster score because, I'd expect Pakistan to reply with a score in excess of 400 or 500 themselves, which is really not good for cricket at all.
Yeah, good toss to win, you'd say.
Yeah, 100%.
It's staggering. It's kind of ironic that people always talking about how we're going to get more people watching Test cricket. What's going to make it more exciting? Well, you'd have to say this was pretty exciting, but at the same time, as you've alluded to, people will be criticising the way the pitch has been prepared. This isn't Test cricket at the heart. The Australian performance perhaps looks more like traditional Test cricket. Whether or not that's the way forward, we'll see. That 506, by the way, the most runs ever scored on the first day of a Test match. Second most runs in a singular day of Test match cricket ever, behind Sri Lanka's 509 against Bangladesh in 2002. And those 4 centurions, Crawley, Duckett, Pope, and Brook, the 24th time a team has scored 4 centuries in an innings in Test match cricket. 2 quick things before we go. Crabs, first of all, I did mention that we'd just be going with the facts because Pearson can be liable to be a bit loose with the truth, and that's been endorsed by one of his great sort of a frat boy college style friends up there at ANU, who today shared with us on social media, and I quote, "Anything Pearson says technically is fake news." I think that's got to be our quote of the day. And before we go, little birdie told me you made your long-awaited return to club cricket at the mighty Blackburn South. You want to tell us about that?
Oh, look, it was. I think I mentioned a couple of my lowlights the other episode. We were actually playing a T20 the other day, and I haven't batted once, done no training at all. So I go out to the middle. I think we are probably 6 down in a T20 in the final over, and we needed 5 or 5 to win it. It was a tense atmosphere, probably like 8 p.m. at night on a Tuesday. which is when cricket should probably not be played. But I must say, after not batting for about 2 years, I was in extremely rusty form, and I'm very lucky that the keeper couldn't run us out as we were running bys. I think I ended up on one not out of three, and I was very fortunate that my partner managed to hit the last ball for four, which set up a good victory in the first game of the season for us. So it's just good to be playing cricket, really. I mean, you forget like this the time you spend out there, you can really enjoy. I mean, you enjoy the little things, the scenery, the weather, the chat, all these sorts of things. But I reckon that might be a thing that you enjoy maybe in the first couple of games, and you get sick of it as the season goes on. So cricket has that weird way of making us all hate it by the end of the season, make us all miss it in the middle of winter.
Yes, well, I'll always remember having the pleasure of being at the non-strikers end when you brought up a century in under 16 junior cricket. So I'm sure there's a lot of form to be rekindled there as you get back into the groove. Rightio, I will not be back, but I'm sure I'll be seeing you again, perhaps at some point over the summer with our daily test recaps. But for now, thanks for being with me, and see you when we see you.
No worries. Thanks for having us on.
Rightio, and that's it from us. We'll be back tomorrow with the day 3 recap, but at the moment, it's the West Indies none for 74 at the close on day 2, still trailing the Australians by 524. Bye for now.